Hello, fellow seekers. Let us begin with some postulates, from which we will try to devise a more cohesive picture of what reality might be. If nothing is defined as a state of true absence without potentiality, dimensions, or attributes, then it cannot give rise to something, as it lacks the inherent properties required to generate existence. This implies that if something now exists, then nothing has never been the absolute state of existence. Therefore, something must have always existed. If this reasoning holds, it follows logically that the foundational something is a primordial substrate, a base reality from which all other entities are derived. This proto-substrate must possess specific properties. First, it must be singular, for if there were multiple proto-substrates, they could not be separated by nothingness, as the absence of a medium between them would prevent any distinction. Similarly, the proto-substrate must be boundless and infinite, as a finite boundary would imply a surrounding void which cannot exist. This proto-substrate, the most elementary form of existence, would likely be homogenous, possessing only the essential attributes necessary for its own existence, yet containing within itself the capacity to interact and give rise to the diverse structures observed in reality. Space itself may be conceptualized as this universal substrate from which all things emerge, akin to intricate forms sculpted from an infinite, cohesive medium. All entities within existence can be seen as configurations of condensed space, matter, and energy, ultimately interconnected as expressions of space interacting with itself. No discrete boundary truly divides finite objects from space. Rather, objects are phase transitions within space, much as ice exists within water without a fundamental change in the underlying substance. Movement of physical objects occurs relative to one another within this space, not within a framework of absolute coordinates. The concept of motion in an infinite space with a single object lacks meaning, as positional reference requires at least two entities to establish relativity. Coordinates, if imposed, are merely arbitrary constructs for comparing positions, not intrinsic attributes of the substrate. Measurement, likewise, is an arbitrary imposition. For instance, the concept of a square foot cannot be detached from the space it occupies. All measurements are fundamentally comparisons relative to a chosen unit. Whether one describes a surface as 30 inches by 60 inches or 10 hands by 20 hands, each is an equally subjective basis for assessing spatial relations. Time, defined conventionally as the progression of events, does not exist independently. It is simply a way of counting recurring changes. Time measures the frequency of predictable phenomena, such as planetary rotations or atomic transitions. When we say a car travels at 50 miles per hour, we mean it covers a specific distance over a countable period of repetitive motion. Similarly, when a person is 1 year old, this signifies that Earth has completed 365 rotations since their birth. Thus, a clock does not quantify an independent entity called time, but simply counts iterative changes in its mechanism. Without change, there is no time. The human experience of time is merely the observation of changes relative to recurring processes. Space, fundamentally, has never been static. Were it so, no external force could alter its state, as it would be singular and infinite, leaving no other with which it could interact. Therefore, space must be intrinsically dynamic, capable of self-interaction by its own properties. In its infinitude, there is no possibility for other foundational realities to coexist. Space alone, dynamic and self-interacting, forms the basis of all existence. Let's try to put all of these ideas together. To develop a cohesive picture of reality based on these postulates and available observational data, we start with the assertion that nothing has never been the state of existence. In the absolute absence of anything, defined as the true nothing, lacking potential, dimension, or attribute, nothing could produce something. Thus, the undeniable existence of something suggests that a foundational proto-substrate has always been and must be the basis of all existence. The infinite and eternal proto-substrate. This proto-substrate, by necessity, has distinct characteristics. It must be singular and unbroken. Since nothing cannot separate entities within an infinite space, the proto-substrate is singular without fundamental divisions. Multiplicity or separation would imply a between composed of nothing, which cannot exist in this model. Infinite and boundless. It extends infinitely with no confines or boundaries, as boundaries would imply an outside or external realm which cannot exist in an infinite system. Homogeneous and dynamic. This substrate has the simplest possible structure, uniform yet inherently dynamic, containing the minimal attributes necessary to exist while being capable of self-interaction. This proto-substrate can be equated with space itself, where all phenomena are variations or configurations of this substrate, akin to how ice is a phase of water. All things exist within this continuous medium, whether as matter, energy, or forces, with no fundamental distinction between things and the substrate they exist within. Space as the basis of all existence. Within this framework, space is not merely a backdrop, but the universal substrate. Matter and energy are states of condensed space, forms taken by self-interacting space. Thus, all entities are fundamentally interconnected and inseparable from space. Finite objects are only apparently finite, as each lacks a true boundary, just as ice does not fundamentally differ from water. Instead, boundaries signify a change in state, a shift within the same substrate, not an actual separation. Movement as relative position in an infinite singular substrate. Movement arises only through the relative positioning of objects. If there were only a single object within this boundless substrate, the concept of movement would lose meaning, as no coordinates or spatial relationships could be mapped within an unbounded medium. Motion, therefore, is relational, defined not by an absolute reference, but by the positional relationship between entities. Measurement as relative comparison sur man. Measurement in this context is entirely arbitrary, as any metric or unit is merely a relative comparison. No measurement can exist independently within the infinite substrate, for it is always a comparison of one part of space to another. Units, whether inches, meters, or hand widths, are imposed to describe spatial relations within the continuous whole, not intrinsic characteristics of space itself. Time as a measurement of change. Time, similarly, is not an independent entity. It is the iterative counting of change, defined by repetitive, predictable phenomena such as planetary rotation or atomic oscillation. Clocks do not measure time, but record consistent, repetitive changes. Without change, time ceases to hold meaning, for there would be no process to mark its passage. In this view, time is a concept tied to the occurrence of change, without intrinsic existence apart from it. The eternal dynamism of space as the universal substrate has never been static. If it had been, no external force or entity could have altered it, for it is the only existing substrate, infinite and singular. Thus, space is inherently dynamic, with the capacity to interact within itself, forming various configurations that manifest as observable reality. This self-interaction gives rise to the diversity of matter, energy, and forces. Implications of a beginningless and self-interacting space. If space has always been dynamic, then it has been interacting with itself eternally, leading to important implications. infinite possibilities realized. Given infinite time and a dynamic self-interacting substrate, all possibilities that can be realized within space have likely already occurred an infinite number of times. Each unique arrangement of space, each form of matter, each energy state has been realized, dissolved, and reformed in the endless interactions within this infinite field. Our current reality, with its specific configurations and relationships, is one among countless iterations, each iteration a consequence of the eternal self-interaction of space, cyclic reformation and recurrence. Since every possible state has been realized, patterns and forms may recur, cyclically manifesting and dissipating. This process is less like a repeating cycle and more like infinite, recurrent variations on similar themes, shaped by the same substrate but infinitely reshaped by its own internal dynamism. This suggests that all phenomena, from galaxies to life forms, are transient expressions of a substrate in continuous reformation. Potential for consciousness and perception. Within an infinite, eternally dynamic space, complex arrangements, such as those we identify as life and consciousness, are inevitable. These phenomena are simply configurations of space, patterns within the proto-substrate that allow for awareness and perception. Our consciousness, then, is a fleeting but recurrent formation within this infinite reality, with consciousness itself perhaps being an inevitable result of the infinite possibilities of space interacting with itself. Interconnectedness and unity. Humanity, along with all other phenomena, is an expression of this singular substrate. As all things are derived from space, distinctions are superficial and functional rather than fundamental. This unity suggests that every action, every thought, and every experience is, in a sense, an action of space itself, continuously interacting within its own boundless form. Existential implications. If all possibilities have already been realized, then the uniqueness of the present moment lies not in its novelty, but in the specific arrangement of space at this point. Each moment is a reconfiguration within the infinite field of possibilities, reminding us that our existence is neither an isolated event nor a singular reality, but part of an infinite and eternally unfolding pattern. Conclusion. Humanity's place in an infinite reality. In this picture of reality, space is the timeless, infinite substrate, continuously interacting within itself. All observable phenomena are configurations within this proto-substrate, arising from the dynamism inherent to space. Time and measurement are relative constructs imposed to describe changes and relationships, while movement is the comparison of positions within this singular, boundless substrate. For humanity, this framework suggests that we are an inseparable part of an eternal reality where each moment, configuration, and experience has already been realized in infinite variations. Our consciousness is a temporary yet inevitable expression of space's self-interaction, providing us with a profound sense of unity with all existence. This perspective encourages us to embrace interconnectedness, find meaning in recurrence, and recognize that every form of existence is an intrinsic part of the infinite and eternal whole. Thank you for spending time with me in the great abyss of knowledge that we call home.